So we're doing something a little different today, which is that we have transferred the feast day of St. Francis of Assisi, which is October 4th, yesterday, to today as a way of closing out our season of creation. Now, St. Francis is often associated with creation because, among other things, besides being a person who embraced the poor and had a sense of justice and preached out in the streets, he was also a person who, because of the particular gifts God had given to him, he was able to have a sense of being in community with creation and in particular animals. And so that's why we associate blessing of the animals, blessing of pets with St. Francis. They say that he once, that sometimes he would preach sermons in front of, to the birds. That might be a good way of practicing a sermon, maybe, right? But this idea that he saw a kinship with not just fellow human beings, but with other creatures as well. So he was said to have preached a sermon to 100 bluebirds. And so if you ever see a St. Francis statue, we might have one out on the grounds, I'm not sure, but a lot of churches do, and oftentimes Francis has a bird on his shoulder or is holding a bird in his hand. So that's the story behind that. And on the front of your order of worship today is, I think, a really striking painting by Michael Smither of St. Francis and the Wolf. And later in the sermon, I'll share with you the story behind this painting. There's a little bit of it on the back cover, but there's a lot more that's worth hearing. And another story of how Francis was able to have a connection and be able to communicate with animals. St. Francis is a patron saint of animals and those who care for them, but also a patron saint of merchants. And you might not know as much about that part of St. Francis's story, so I'll tell you a little bit. And of course, there's all sorts of versions of his life story in books and online if you want to kind of dig deeper. But a bit about Francis's story. When Francis was born, his father was away on a trip to France, and his mother was there at home in what we now call Italy, and she decided to go ahead and name the baby Giovanni, which in honor of John the Baptist, because Giovanni is John in that language. So, and she went ahead and had the baby baptized. So father comes home, and he wasn't really pleased about either of those choices that she made while he was away. So he decided to rename the baby Francisco after his love of France and having just arrived back from there, and that's where he was when the baby was born. So that's why St. Francis is, Francisco or Francis, and rather instead of St. Giovanni. So his father was a businessman, a merchant himself. And so he raised Francisco to come up and kind of take over the family business, which is a familiar story. He wanted Francisco to be a merchant as well. And so in his younger life, as a young adult, Francis was being trained by his father, kind of shadowing him in the family business, and also kind of living a wilder life, as some people do, sowing his oats in his young adulthood. Meanwhile, his mother, kind of like St. Monica, Augustine's mother, Francis's mother was praying for him and hoping for a conversion of the way he was living his life and that he might feel a closeness to God. And little by little, Francis started to kind of feel those stirrings that were pulling him closer to God and feeling like he was hearing from God in some interesting ways that were worth stopping and listening to. One of those stories is he was riding along on a horse and he comes across a leper, and he gets off the horse and approaches the leper and feels led to give him a kiss of peace, to give a leper a kiss of peace, to touch them in any way. was something that he wouldn't normally have done, but he just felt led to do it. And then the leper gave him a kiss of peace in return. And in Francis's story, that's considered one of those turning points where he really felt moved by God and sensed God to connect with people in a different way. Another story from his life that's worth sharing is this was at the time of the Crusades, and Francis, along with many young men, was going to go off to the Crusades. But when you go off to the Crusades, it's a good idea to have a suit of armor. And so because he was from a family that had the means, his father paid for him to have a suit of armor made to take with him when he rode off toward participating in the Crusades. And of course, as an aside, today we don't look so kindly on the Crusades as far as a way of spreading Christianity by force, but those were the circumstances of the time. So he had his suit of armor and he rides off, and it's a long journey from where he was to where the Crusades were happening. But he only went one day down the road. And after one day, he felt a stirring that he needed to return home, that he wasn't meant to go. And I don't know that he was necessarily feeling that for ideological reasons, but just for some unexplainable reason, he didn't feel he was meant to go, which is probably good as far as, because he might not have made it back and we wouldn't have all of his ministry and influence on the church today. So he turns around and goes home. His father is not very excited to see him back, and it becomes a point of great conflict and tension in the family, because for a young man to be going off to the Crusades and to come home without only making it a day down the road brought a sense of shame or dishonor to him and the family, because it wasn't seen as the right thing to do. And so from that point on in their community, he kind of had this cloud over him of like, this is a coward, this is someone who didn't do what we thought he should do. But he was back home, back in the family business, but still hearing these stirrings, these kind of nudges from God in his mind and his heart. And so he got another nudge, kind of like he did to go interact with the leper, but this one day he felt that God was telling him to go rebuild the church. Now when Francis received this kind of message from God, he kind of took it as church with a little c. So thinking of, I need to go rebuild an actual building, an actual church building. And there was one in his area that needed some fixing up. It was kind of crumbling in some ways. But he didn't have the means on his own to do it. So he had a good intention. But he went to the family business, which apparently entailed dealing in some expensive fabrics, and he took a bolt of expensive fabric and then he went and sold it to make money to do something good, which was to help rebuild this church with a little c. I think, as we now know, he was actually kind of called to do some rebuilding of the church with a capital C in terms of all he brought as far as the rule of life and the creation of the Franciscan order and the embrace of the poor. But he took it really literally that day. This got him into some trouble. Actually, it came not just to his father, but it came to the attention of the bishop of his area. And that way, in those days, bishops were over smaller areas, and they were much more aware of what people in their little area did. But the bishop gave him absolution and said, now it's for you to go admit your wrongdoing and make it right, by returning what you took or the money that you got for what you took. But it was another one of those real turning points in the life of Francis. And what the bishop told him was, in that moment, he said to him, I want to find the exact quote for you. The bishop told him that you can give this back and not have to worry, because God has given you all that you need. And Francis really took that to heart, and it became, again, another turning point of him embracing a life in which a life of poverty, a life of feeling like material things were not what he needed to orient his life around. And as people came alongside him to join him in this kind of very different lifestyle, he gained companions in the way, and eventually that became what we know as the Order of St. Francis, the Franciscans. And God directed him to 3 particular passages in the Bible. One was the command to the rich young man to sell all his goods and give to the poor. Another was the order to apostles to take nothing on their journey. And finally, the demand to take up the cross daily. And when he received those 3 passages that God directed him to in Scripture, Francis said, "Here is our rule." And it was as simple and as seemingly impossible as that. He was never really setting out to found a religious order, by the way. It just kind of happened to him. Other people saw this life he was embracing and wanted to join him in that, and there are still lots of Franciscans today. You don't have to be ordained into it. It's actually an order that is quite welcoming of people in lots of walks of life. But I wanted to share with you in particular this story that is depicted in the painting on the front of your order of service, and then the smaller version on the back with the information about the artist. And this is the legend of St. Francis and the wolf. I'm going to say of Gubbio. I'm not sure if that's the exact Italian pronunciation. But I'm taking the version of this story that comes from a place called the Taming the Wolf Institute. So a whole nonprofit organization that has named themselves after this beautiful story. And so sometimes I'm going to paraphrase from it, but there may be times when I use their wording because it's really, I think, a beautifully written account. And you can find, there's different versions of the story, but this one seemed to be one of the more developed ones I found when I was researching the sermon for today. So with all that backstory of what I told you about Francis and how he went from being this kind of rebellious young man who didn't want to be in the family business to be, founding this religious order or brotherhood of people who embraced poverty and embraced being amongst the marginalized and listening to nature, he developed kind of a reputation for himself there in their part of Italy. So there was a town that was, close enough to get to by walking called Gubbio, and it was a prosperous village, but it had a big problem. It had a wolf who was eating livestock and then attacking the people who were trying to protect the livestock. And they had never in this town encountered such a fierce predator of their animals. This wolf killed a shepherd and then killed a shepherd's brother and father when they went out to see what had happened, and then killed killed 2 of 3 other people that the mayor had sent to look into it and deal with the wolf. So as you can imagine, if you've got a wolf who's eating your livestock, killing people who are trying to intervene, there seems like nothing can be done to stop this fierce and powerful animal, the story quickly spreads. Fear was gripping everyone in the area and in the town. Parents were keeping their children inside. People were keeping weapons at the ready, and everyone was on edge. Their defenses were raised. And the mayor of the town consulted with his advisors, and they decided they couldn't think of anything else to do except to send someone to go talk to Francis, because they had heard that Francis had a connection with animals as well as a connection with God. And so they sent a few people to find Francis in Assisi and to beg him to come and help them as soon as he could. Now Francis, of course, was moved by their situation and definitely felt called to go be with them and try to do what he could, but he wasn't ready to go immediately. Francis was a man of contemplation and prayer, and he didn't really see that they needed to hurry, so he invited them to join him and the brothers in his order and to have dinner and to pray about it and get a good night's sleep, and that they would walk together back toward the town the next morning. They get to the town and they get there, and the mayor and the townspeople want him to act immediately. And again, Francis puts them off and says, no, I want to talk to you, I want to hear your stories, and then I'm going to go home and eat a good meal and pray about it and get a good night's sleep. And then we'll get up in the morning, and then I will go and meet the wolf. And so that is just what Francis did, though everyone else was really pressing him to go ahead and act. So here's where I'm going to read some parts of the story as written by the Taming the Wolf Institute as well. So early the next morning, refreshed and confident that this would work out, Francis was accompanied by some of the townspeople to the gates of the town. And they wished him well and retreated to their homes because they didn't want to go out with him into the woods to see this ferocious wolf. So he walked on to the woods, ready to find and engage with this wolf. And as he neared the first stand of trees, the wolf appeared and began to stalk Francis. His slow, deliberate steps, the walk of a predator, announced his intention. He drew nearer and nearer, closing in a circle around the holy man from Assisi. But seeing the wolf, Francis didn't feel fear. He felt a connection. He made the sign of the cross, and he called the wolf to meet him in peace under the grace of the Lord. The wolf watched as Francis came closer. Come, brother wolf, I will not hurt you. Let us talk in peace. The wolf froze mid-step and struggled with doubt and uncertainty. Finally, understanding that Francis meant to do him no harm, the wolf walked to Francis, sat back on his haunches, and was ready to listen. Francis told the wolf that he had come from the town, and he described all of the fear and the sorrow that the townspeople were experiencing because of the wolf's actions. He described the pain and resentment that they were holding toward the wolf. So Francis, because God had given him the gift of being able to communicate with animals, he asked the wolf, how did this come to happen? Why did you kill the livestock and the people? And so the wolf told Francis his story. He'd been, in fact, left behind by his pack because he had gotten injured and he couldn't keep up. And so he was left by himself to catch prey that didn't run fast, that he, with his injuries, could catch, like sheep and goats, even though he'd really prefer to eat deer and rabbits like he normally would. But with his injured leg, that was out of the question. He explained to Francis that all he wanted was to eat when he was hungry. So Francis pressed him to explain his actions, and the wolf continued to tell the stories of why he had killed the shepherd and the shepherd's family and the guards the mayor sent from the city. Ultimately, the wolf was explaining to Francis that he killed them because he felt threatened by them. They were coming to kill him, so he defended himself and killed them first. So as Francis took the time to listen, he could see that the wolf was only acting to fill his needs, though he did cause loss of life and harm. He had made unfortunate choices that affected people of whom he knew nothing. And through Francis, the wolf was able to understand and feel the pain of the people in the town and began to feel remorseful. He was sorry for the pain that he had caused once he was confronted with it. But he needed to eat. What could he do? So Francis did what Francis was also good at doing besides talking to animals. He prayed. He prayed for hours with the wolf sitting close by. And the wolf watched closely, not fully understanding what was taking place, but sensing that Francis had believed him and the remorse that he felt at causing such pain. So when Francis came out of this time of deep prayer and contemplation, he suggested that God had given him an answer to the dilemma. The dilemma could be solved if the wolf had a reliable way to be fed. And the town would be kept safe from the wolf. The plan that Francis wanted to propose to the wolf and the townspeople was that the townspeople would adopt the wolf and feed him and care for him, and in return the wolf would stop killing the people and their livestock and would instead become a protector of their town. Now the wolf was open to this and thought it would work well for him, but he worried that people wouldn't be able to forgive him and would still try to kill him. Francis understood the wolf's concern and assured him that he would present himself the idea to the townspeople in a way that they would indeed forgive the wolf and welcome him into their town. He knew that they could let go of their fear and hate if they saw the wolf ask for forgiveness and accede to a peaceful relationship. And so Francis extended his hand to the wolf. And as the story goes, the wolf showed his agreement by placing his paw in Francis's hand. And then together, Francis and the wolf walked back to the town. And as they neared the gate, the citizens couldn't believe their eyes because it seemed like Francis was just walking into the town with his pet dog. And people, though, were still on their guard, even though they saw that the wolf was being peaceful. So Francis invited the mayor and all the townspeople to come and hear what he had heard from the wolf, that the wolf was remorseful and the wolf was hungry and was seeking their forgiveness. And it took them a little while to accept it. They did not immediately accept Francis's plan. They wanted time to talk about it amongst themselves and question Francis about how this would all work. But in the end, finally, after many tears, they found within themselves compassion for the wolf. And at Francis's suggestion, they addressed him, moving on, as Brother Wolf. And so in that moment, Francis asked the mayor and Brother Wolf to declare a pact, that the people would be safe from the wolf, and the wolf would be safe from them. And everyone expressed joy that the shadow of fear had been lifted from their town. And in what was a really defining moment in this story, the wife of the first shepherd who was killed, the first to fall to the wolf, approached the wolf and brought out food to feed him and care for him, that she was the first to do so. And as she did, as the story goes, she was crying in relief to have the burden of hate lifted from her spirit. And Brother Wolf and everyone was eating together. Word spread to other towns, and soon the people of the town were proclaiming proudly that they had their own special wolf, Brother Wolf. And he lived amongst them for another 2 years until he died, cared for by the generous and forgiving town. I think there's a lot that we can learn from the story of St. Francis and the wolf. Well, not really, it's not just Francis and the wolf's story, it's the story of a whole town of people who had once been afraid, who came to have peace and forgiveness amongst themselves and this creature who they thought had been a threat to them. And I think it's also a good illustration of what we hear in our gospel, and the readings today are the ones actually appointed for the feast of St. Francis, our gospel that ends with this line about people who are not rich toward God. But I think what we hear in this story is a story of people who learned how to be rich toward the wolf, and in so doing, rich toward God. And so now when you look at this picture of St. Francis and the wolf, you may notice new things. You may notice and now understand how it is that Francis and this wolf can stand side by side without fear. You can notice the gentleness of the wolf. He's not ferocious. He seems to have a sense of peace. And we see Francis crouched by him in prayer. And so, as we close today, I wonder how this story might speak to you and speak to us in our own lives and in our own times. And I pray that you will carry this story in your heart and reflect how God is speaking to you through it today. Amen.